1853. The arrival of Commodore Matthew Perry's black ships was more than a simple encounter. It was a cultural shockwave. This shockwave ignited Japan's intense drive toward military modernization. Confronted by the technological superiority of the West, Japan began a rapid transformation. It shed centuries of isolation to build a formidable military machine. By 1937, when the Sino-Japanese War began, the fervor for military service was widespread. This fervor was fueled by early, seemingly unstoppable victories. Young men like Tsurugi Akikusa felt the strong pull of this national ambition. His path, however, was altered by his father's protective hand. His father redirected him from the short, glorious lifespan of a pilot. Instead, Akikusa was sent into the relative obscurity of a naval radioman. Akikusa's subsequent training at the Yokosuka 2nd Kaihaiden was rigorous. It was designed not merely to create sailors. The goal was to forge warriors psychologically prepared for absolute sacrifice. Recruits were subjected to a constant barrage of physical and psychological stress. This stress instilled the core tenets of the Gunjin Chokuyu. These tenets demanded absolute loyalty. They also demanded avoidance of the shameful crime of soiling your name by being taken alive as a prisoner. This intense indoctrination transformed military service into a spiritual destiny. The symbols of this commitment were pervasive throughout the culture. Every soldier carried the knowledge of their ultimate duty. This duty was encapsulated in the phrase, "Duty is heavier than a mountain, life is lighter than a feather." The mountain symbolized birth and renewal. This philosophy made duty to the nation the weightiest, most sacred element of existence. For naval officers, the traditional dagger was invested with powerful mythology. Its allure was captured in the phrase, "Oni yoke, ona yose." This was a charm meant to keep demons away and to attract women. The ultimate sacrifice, Jokusai, or total annihilation, was not framed as a military failure. It was understood as a spiritual transition. It meant crossing the river Sanzu, the Buddhist equivalent of the river Styx. These deep cultural anchors made the Japanese soldier psychologically resolute. They were prepared to view death in battle as the highest form of honor. While the nation mobilized its youth, its intelligence apparatus was tracking the expanding conflict. Naval Academy graduate Tsunezo Wachi, operating under the code name L, was deeply entrenched in espionage. He gathered critical information on American diplomatic maneuvers. Wachi's network observed major diplomatic shifts. One key shift was the U.S.-Mexico Treaty. This treaty led to the deportation of Japanese diplomats, including Ambassador Kichisaburo Nomura. The diplomats were expelled from New York in June of 1942. This intelligence confirmed the conflict was rapidly expanding. It demanded that Japan secure its Central Pacific perimeter immediately. As the war progressed, Iwo Jima emerged as a crucial strategic necessity. It was a small, desolate volcanic island. Imperial General Headquarters viewed it as an essential refueling and staging area for reconnaissance missions. It offered the only forward base capable of launching anti-shipping attacks against the growing American fleet. The island was a vital link in the chain of defense. It was a necessary buffer. If Iwo Jima were lost, American air power would be within striking distance of the Japanese mainland. Even before the full tide of the American advance reached its shores, Iwo Jima was marked for fortification. This lonely outpost was destined to become the epicenter of a desperate final stand. Late June of 1944, the devastation of the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot sounded the death knell for Iwo Jima's offensive capabilities. The battle stripped the island of its remaining air power. This effectively ended its function as an airbase. Iwo Jima was now transformed solely into a target. Veteran pilot Saburo Sakai admitted the war was lost the moment Saipan fell. He recognized the irreversible shift in power. Aviator Isamu Miyazaki captured the grim arithmetic of attrition. He stated that, in the skies over Iwo Jima, every day there was more of them and fewer of us. The remaining veteran pilots were dispersed to land-based units. This action left the island exposed. It signaled the imminent and inevitable American assault. This mounting crisis brought Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi to Iwo Jima in June of 1944. Kuribayashi was a meticulous commander. He arrived with a profound understanding of the strategic reality. He knew traditional Japanese beach defense was suicidal against overwhelming American firepower. Kuribayashi immediately swore an oath to inflict heavy casualties. He understood his mission was not to win the battle, it was to bleed the enemy dry and delay the invasion of the homeland. He accelerated construction, championing a strategy of in-depth siege defense. He drew lessons from the recent costly defense of Peleliu. This plan mandated the construction of deep, interlocking fortifications. It prioritized concealment over direct confrontation. Kuribayashi's personal commitment was codified in his Oath of Combat. It included the motto Shichisho Hokoku, which means serve the country 7 times. This was a spiritual vow to reincarnate repeatedly to defend the nation. Kuribayashi's radical defensive strategy clashed immediately with the traditions of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Navy commanders adhered to the outdated doctrine of a traditional waterline defense. These commanders included Commander Kiyoshi Urabe of the 3rd Air Fleet and Captain Samaji Inoue of the Nanpo Shoto Naval Air Group. They demanded that the fight begin directly on the beaches. They believed the airfields must be protected at all costs. Kuribayashi, supported by Lieutenant Colonel Kaneji Nakane, argued fiercely against this. He wanted to sacrifice the airfields. His goal was to draw the Americans into a subterranean war of attrition. The resulting strategic conflict revealed the deep fragmentation of command. It implicitly debunked the myth of a unified Japanese defense. Kuribayashi eventually sided with the in-depth plan, but the resistance forced a compromise. Many officers, including Ensign Satoru Omagari, believed this compromise weakened both approaches. It did so by dividing already scarce resources. Even before the invasion, intense internal rivalries surfaced. Commander Sunizo Wachi, the anti-aircraft head, clashed with Captain Inoue. Their argument centered on the use of limited ammunition. This conflict preceded Wachi's transfer in mid-October. Despite the inter-service friction, the militarization of the island continued at a frantic pace. The peaceful civilian outpost was transformed into a critical defensive stronghold. Commander Wachi oversaw the careful concealment of heavy artillery. This included 28 5-inch naval anti-aircraft guns. It also included older 5.5-inch naval rifles. He positioned them within camouflaged concrete casemate bunkers. This ensured they would survive the pre-invasion bombardment. Ensign Minoru Tada demonstrated remarkable ingenuity. He lowered his anti-aircraft guns into protective pits. He also repurposed the hulks of wrecked aircraft as bunkers. This pragmatic move earned Wachi's rare praise. Wachi told him, "Good job." He added, "These aircraft are serving the country twice." But the men tasked with this monumental labor were suffering immensely. Reinforcements arriving from Japan were often ill-equipped and poorly trained. They were largely draftees, teenage volunteers, or aging retreads. They formed independent units that were hastily slapped together. They endured primitive conditions. These were characterized by extreme heat inside the tunnels. A pervasive stench rose from unsanitary latrines. There were constant outbreaks of amoebic dysentery. Malnutrition and dehydration were rampant. This suffering was exacerbated by the sheer physical toll of hauling dirt and rock from the excavations. The hunger was maddening. Radio men like Tsurugi Akikusa risked severe punishment by stealing food rations before their deployment. This desperate measure underscored the grim reality faced by the defenders. Isolated on the volcanic ash, they waited for an inevitable and brutal confrontation. The 249-day prelude to the invasion was a slow, grinding death sentence for Iwo Jima's defenders. The American blockade was executed with ruthless efficiency by the U.S. submarine fleet. This action crippled Japan's ability to reinforce or resupply the isolated garrison. Shortages were already acute due to the island's barren volcanic nature. These shortages quickly intensified into maddening scarcity. Army maintenance man Corporal Shinjiro Nishi watched the logistics chain collapse entirely. This confirmed his initial dreadful realization that the war was already lost. The overwhelming industrial might of the enemy was inescapable. This might was represented by the incessant, roaring flyovers. Warships occasionally materialized on the horizon. This was a force Japan simply could not counter. The Army's supply situation was particularly dire. It relied on erratic and unreliable cargo ship mail delivery. This stood in stark contrast to the Navy's system. The Navy's airmail system was somewhat more efficient, though still endangered. This disparity fueled bitterness and deepened the psychological toll on the troops. The men were starving, suffering from malnutrition and dehydration. They also suffered the pervasive effects of amoebic dysentery. This was due to poor sanitation and the lack of potable water. General Kuribayashi focused on the brutal pragmatism of subterranean defense. He repeatedly pleaded with Imperial General Headquarters, or IGHQ. He begged them for concrete water purification tablets and ammunition. Instead, he received bewildering shipments. These underscored the profound disconnect between the distant command and the frontline reality. Ensign Satoru Omagari witnessed one of the most galling logistical blunders. Despite the desperate need for rifles and ammunition, a Betty bomber arrived. It had risked penetrating the American blockade. Its precious cargo space was filled not with necessities. Instead, it was filled with bundles of freshly cut bamboo stalks. Omagari was enraged by this blunder. He questioned the sanity of IGHQ for sending panda food instead of supplies to starving soldiers. The incident left a lasting resentment. It was a knot in his stomach that tightened whenever he saw bamboo. It served as a visceral reminder of airmen risking their lives for useless cargo. Amidst these shortages, the need for reconnaissance became paramount. IGHQ, desperate to track the enemy, continued to demand high-risk missions. This was despite the catastrophic losses they were incurring. The repeated disappearance of Japanese reconnaissance aircraft forced a dreadful realization upon the high command. Iwo Jima, not Okinawa, was the immediate American objective. On February 13, 1945, Lieutenant Junior Grade Bun Hayase reported a sighting. He saw a massive U.S. fleet of 170 ships. This was a horrifying confirmation of the impending assault. Shortly thereafter, Lieutenant Narita's Mert recon plane vanished entirely. It was lost to the swarm of American fighters. This left no doubt about the overwhelming scale of the force gathering in the darkness. The relentless American naval power ensured that reinforcing the island remained a suicidal endeavor. On January 5, 1945, the transport ship SBT-154 attempted a delivery. It carried much-needed cargo and personnel near Iwo Jima. The vessel was a specialized landing craft, capable of carrying troops and material. It was intercepted by Allied forces. The ship was quickly sunk. The sinking claimed the lives of its entire 90-man crew. It also killed the wounded evacuees it carried. This was a stark, silent testament to the devastating effectiveness of the American blockade. It showed the high price paid for every failed delivery. As the siege tightened, the psychological pressure became unbearable. Private Toshio Kashimura was suffering from typhoid. He watched his last hope for evacuation vanish. Mechanical issues had grounded the final two planes. He viewed Iwo Jima not as a fortress, but as a tomb. Ensign Omagari observed the logistical failures and the overwhelming power of the enemy. He found himself questioning why peace was not sought to save lives. Within the rigid military structure, this thought bordered on treasonous. Yet, duty remained absolute for the Japanese defenders. On January 1, 1945, General Kuribayashi cemented the island's fanatical resolve. He did this by distributing his oaths of combat. These manifestos were later found on the bodies of the dead soldiers. They symbolized the ultimate commitment, to fight to the death. This commitment remained regardless of the strategic futility. Rear Admiral Ichimaru, commander of the Navy units, echoed this sentiment. He urged his men to act with fierce determination. The Japanese defenders were not awaiting rescue. They were preparing for their final, inevitable sacrifice. They were bound by the code that forbade surrender and promised a glorious death in the service of the Emperor. The bombardment was the final harbinger of the assault. On February 16, 1945, the sea seemed to give birth to a mountain range of steel. Rear Admiral William H.P. Blandy's Task Force 52 unleashed a continuous, deafening barrage. The island shuddered violently. The ground churned under the impact of 16-inch shells. These shells came from the battleships North Carolina and Washington. P-37 fighters and F-6F Hellcats swarmed overhead. They carpet-bombed the island with high explosives and strafing runs. This left the volcanic sand studded with spent .50 caliber brass shell casings and steel links. Radioman Akikusa and his comrades huddled deep within their bunkers. The air was thick with sulfur and dust. They knew that the relentless bombardment was merely the overture to the invasion. That invasion would turn Iwo Jima into a charnel house. The American invasion of Iwo Jima began not with the thunder of boots on black sand. It began with the silent, cold infiltration of the UDT frogmen. Ernie Pyle famously called them half fish and half nuts. On the days preceding the landing, these reconnaissance specialists plunged into the 59-degree water. They carried demolition bags and sand analysis sacks. Approximately 150 frogmen participated in the initial mission. They faced heavy machine gun fire from concealed Japanese positions. This was a sharp, deadly warning that the island was very much alive. This preliminary engagement was a mere whisper compared to the deluge that followed. On the morning of February 19, 1945, the vast American armada delivered the first wave of Marines. Akikusa had likened this armada to a mountain range that had risen up out of the sea. The sheer scale of the assault was overwhelming. The landing craft approached the beaches. Akikusa described them as a crowd of baseball fans waiting for the stadium to open. The Japanese defenders, under the strict command of Lieutenant General Kuribayashi, held their breath. This was the core of Kuribayashi's strategy. He planned to allow the enemy to commit fully. He wanted them to crowd the beaches with men, boats, and vehicles. Only then would he unleash hell. For the initial minutes, the Marines moved across the soft, black volcanic sand with unnerving ease. They believed the naval bombardment had completely neutralized the defenses. Then, the silence broke catastrophically. Concealed Japanese artillery, positioned in camouflaged concrete casemate bunkers, opened fire simultaneously. The beaches immediately transformed into a slaughterhouse. American ships, caught flat-footed, took heavy damage. The USS Pensacola was struck. This killed 17 men and wounded nearly 100 others. Rear Admiral Bertram J. Rogers realized that these batteries required point-blank fire to neutralize. The Japanese utilized every weapon at their disposal. These ranged from the Type 147mm anti-tank guns. They also included the Type 80 950mm knee mortar grenade launchers. These mortars were nicknamed flying ash cans for their distinctive trajectory. They inflicted massive casualties on the initial landing waves. Amidst the chaos, the Marines relentlessly pushed forward. Their eyes were fixed on the iconic, dormant volcano dominating the island's southern tip, Mount Suribachi. The successful isolation of Suribachi was a key objective. The fighting to achieve it was brutal. By February 23rd, the mountain was secured. The iconic flag raising that day became an immediate, powerful symbol of American victory and sacrifice. It signaled that the first strategic objective had been achieved. Yet the Japanese knew the fight was far from over. The battle immediately transitioned into the grinding, subterranean conflict Kuribayashi had engineered. This phase, centered on the northern plateau, earned the sector the collective name, the Meat Grinder. Japanese defensive strongpoints were interwoven with interlocking fields of fire. These strongpoints included Nidan-Iwa, the amphitheater, Charlie Dog Ridge, and the Tamanayama Communications Bunker. They were constructed from cement, rebar, and boulders. The Marines faced endless resistance from spider holes, known as tako subo. These were small, camouflaged pits that allowed a single soldier to fire and disappear. They also faced the massive, labyrinthine tunnel systems. Omagari later described the brutal reality of this phase. He stated that men did not just die on Iwo Jima. He said they were ripped apart, torn to shreds, and scattered. To counter the deeply fortified Japanese bunkers, the Marines deployed a terrifying new tool. This tool was specialized flamethrower tanks. These were the Sherman M4A3, Ronson, and Zippo models. They were equipped with Mark I flamethrowers. These machines proved crucial, searing the defenders out of positions that conventional fire could not touch. Corporal Herschel Williams fought for 4 hours under terrific enemy fire. He repeatedly returned to prepare demolition charges and obtain flamethrowers. He used these to wipe out one position after another, earning him the Medal of Honor. The Japanese had attempted to develop their own equivalent weapon. They did so with far less technological success. Near a concrete bunker, the rusted wreckage of a Japanese flamethrower rig was later discovered. This corroded wreck was a silent testament to the limitations of Japanese industrial capacity. While the Americans arrived with reliable, mechanized liquid fire, the Japanese had been forced to attempt a rudimentary solution. This solution was heavy, ineffective, and ultimately failed to solve the same tactical problem. Despite the overwhelming American air and sea superiority, the Japanese refused to concede the air war entirely. On the late afternoon of February 21st, kamikaze planes managed to penetrate the defensive screen. These planes were led by Captain Toshiichi Sugiyama and Vice Admiral Kenpei Teraoka. They struck U.S. ships, and the USS Bismarck Sea was sunk. This demonstrated that the Japanese, even in desperation, posed a continued, lethal threat to the American fleet. Meanwhile, the psychological warfare continued unabated. On the Japanese side, the NHK propaganda broadcast falsely claimed that the Marines had turned tail and run. This was a desperate lie, constantly contradicted by the continuous roar of battle above the bunkers. Within the dark confines of the fortifications, Japanese defenders struggled with paranoia and misinformation. Radioman Akikusa recalled the dark humor that circulated among the men. They questioned if the Americans perceived DDT insecticide as poison gas. The Americans sometimes deployed this insecticide. The Japanese, aware their position was untenable, prepared for their final acts. Ensign Satoru Omagari instructed his remaining men that Iwo Jima would be their tomb. On February 21st, Lieutenant Genichi Hattori led a desperate banzai charge. His letters home had so poignantly humanized the struggle. He was killed early on February 22nd. The fierce resistance, the suicidal fervor, and the commitment to inflict maximum casualties solidified Iwo Jima's reputation. It became known as one of the Pacific's bloodiest battles. It was a relentless cycle of destruction that left no room for retreat or surrender. The final, desperate phase of the Battle of Iwo Jima was defined by fragmentation, futility, and the primal struggle for survival. By mid-March 1945, the island was nominally secured, yet the fighting had devolved into a gruesome, subterranean hunt. The planned general attack, a mass suicide charge, had failed. It failed to achieve anything but mass casualties and widespread disarray. Some commanders had authorized this charge, while others countermanded it. Units, already isolated by the battle's intensity, were now completely cut off. Their command structures were utterly shattered. In the northern reaches of the island, the reality of defeat was inescapable. The last pockets of resistance desperately clung to life there. The overwhelming material superiority of the Americans was a constant demoralizing presence. The Japanese had fought for months in the dust and sulfur to build rudimentary defenses. Conversely, the American Seabees were rapidly transforming the island. They were laying down miles of Marsden matting for airfields. They were constructing pipelines and infrastructure with staggering speed. By April 3rd, Seabees were working on North Field. Incoming pilots like Captain Jerry Yellen arrived 3 days later. They were astonished to find amenities like hot tubs built by the engineers. This was a stark, almost surreal contrast to the starvation, dysentery, and filth endured by the Japanese below ground. This industrial might led to profound disillusionment among the defenders. Junior naval officer Ensign Satoru Omagari was hiding in the labyrinthine tunnels. He lost his faith in the glory of war. He witnessed only the shameful, disgusting truth of thirst, hunger, and the breakdown of human dignity. Foraging became the only priority for the survivors. Soldiers, desperate for water, would sneak out at night to fill canteens. They would only discover that the Americans had deliberately contaminated pools of stagnant water. They used phosphorus grenades for this contamination. The Japanese military code, which forbade surrender, now forced men into acts of extreme desperation. These acts included violence against their own to secure meager rations. The harshness of command, divorced from reality, only exacerbated the chaos. Lieutenant Commander Sasanosuke Tachikawa was isolated in his bunker. He refused to acknowledge the island's reality. He clung to increasingly unrealistic escape plans. These included a crude, great escape to steal a cargo plane. Omagari was tasked with convincing Tachikawa that the airfield was occupied. He knew the futility of such a plan. However, the need for pragmatic survival had replaced military logic. When Tachikawa departed on his ill-fated mission and eventually returned, Omagari effectively assumed command. He shifted focus entirely to foraging and survival. A crucial turning point came when basic human needs superseded military doctrine. By late February, Army Doctor First Lieutenant Kazuyoshi Morimoto's field hospital was critically low on supplies. It possessed only 3 weeks' worth of water. This forced patients to subsist on a half cup of stale water per day. Faced with a choice between his oath as a physician and military duty, Morimoto chose the former. He ultimately surrendered his hospital. This marked the shift from a fight to the death to the reluctant acceptance of American protection. The largest group of Japanese surrendered from this hospital on April 16th. They did so following Captain Iwao Noguchi's orders. The Americans intensified their psychological operations. Bullhorns blared across the island, urging surrender. They promised safety and medical care to the holdouts. The use of Japanese POWs and Nisei soldiers slowly began to erode the cultural stigma of capture. Tech Sergeant Terry Doi was a Nisei soldier who bravely entered caves to persuade holdouts. The surrender leaflets detailed the bombing of Tokyo. They also detailed the humane treatment of 154 captured men and 93 wounded comrades. These men were being treated on a white hospital ship. The leaflets appealed to the soldiers to think before they died like a dog. Despite these efforts, many continued to fight. They were trapped by shame and outdated military doctrine. The Japanese versus Japanese dynamic within the caves was rampant. Isolation bred division and distrust, leading to 2 distinct groups. These were the inside tribe and the outside tribe. The overwhelming effectiveness of American weapons ensured a grim end for those who remained. Flamethrowers and napalm were used relentlessly. Survivors found these weapons terrifying. Omagari described being terrified by liquid fire. He watched as Americans used gasoline-powered pumps to flood and ignite bunkers. This created horrific scenes of drowning and burning. The end of organized resistance was symbolized by the final poignant message. General Kuribayashi sent this message at 5:25 p.m. on March 16th. It was a death poem that spoke of exhausted ammunition and the inability to fulfill duty. He vowed to reincarnate 7 times to seek revenge. Yet, the fighting continued for weeks afterward. The capture of Teruo Sasamine, following a desperate Banzai attack, illustrated the tragic end of adherence to the fight-to-the-death doctrine. Sasamine, a survivor of the charge, was taken prisoner and sent to a POW camp in Hawaii. Meanwhile, Radioman Akikusa had a harrowing ordeal escaping barbed wire traps. He survived the flooding and fire attacks. Akikusa eventually regained consciousness in a U.S. Army field hospital on Guam. He owed his life to an American soldier and his dog. This was a vivid example of survival overriding the expectation of death. For those who surrendered, the encounter with the enemy was often jarringly inconsistent with propaganda. Haruji Mita, a naval aircraft armorer, expected torture. Instead, he experienced the positive treatment of prisoners of war. Mita received medical care from an American medic who expressed a desire for peace. The surrendering soldiers often encountered surprising kindness. They received cigarettes and chocolate bars. Later, as prisoners of war, they received a banquet of food. This banquet included bread, corned beef, mashed potatoes, spinach, pineapple, and coffee. This was a far cry from the starvation they had just endured. Omagari himself was disillusioned and exhausted. He surrendered with 36 holdouts on May 17, 1945. This moment was marked by relief and the crushing weight of command. He, like Akikusa, was processed at Fort McDowell on Angel Island. They were met with surprisingly ample meals despite their deep-seated fears. These fears stemmed from a military culture that criminalized surrender and lacked awareness of international prisoner-of-war conventions. The ample meals included sausages, rice, and apples for breakfast, and sukiyaki for lunch. The journey across America was a profound and disorienting experience. Omagari arrived in Seattle and was astonished by the sheer volume of civilian life. He likened the number of cars he saw to a giant automobile factory. This was a stark, immediate contrast to the scarcity and destruction of their homeland. Many prisoners of war were housed in specialized camps. These included Camp Michaud in Pennsylvania and Fort Eustis in Virginia. At Eustis, German prisoners of war were studying law and medicine. They even welcomed the Japanese with a serenade. They tossed the new arrivals items like soap and cigarettes, an unexpected act of camaraderie. The Japanese prisoners of war engaged in pastimes like gambling for cigarettes. The experience offered an unintentional glimpse into American culture. This included movie nights screening films like Stagecoach and Gone with the Wind. Special re-education camps, such as Camp Kennedy in Texas, actively worked to promote democratic ideals. They used Japanese-speaking U.S. intelligence officers to facilitate communication. The humane treatment of the captured men profoundly challenged the monolithic perceptions of the enemy. It revealed a complex spectrum of human experience. Naval Radioman Akikusa experienced a moment of unexpected nostalgia. Hans, the German cook at Fort Eustis, noticed Akikusa's injured hand. He served Akikusa a plate of Japanese curry rice. This delicacy brought tears to his eyes. For many, the prisoner of war experience became a psychological bridge. It allowed them to process the trauma of Iwo Jima. They realized that survival, not jokosai, was the true value. The war was over, but for the survivors of Iwo Jima, the battle continued internally. It was fought in the silent valleys of memory. The psychological burden of survival was immense. This burden is often referred to as amnesic experiences. Veterans like Tsurugi Akikusa and Satoru Omagari carried the shameful, disgusting truth. This truth was not of defeat, but of the breakdown of order. It included the starvation, the thirst, and the horrific internal conflicts within the caves. Akikusa had kept journals, but for decades the memories remained locked away. They were too painful to share. He understood that the war he experienced could never be reconciled with the idealized narrative of glorious sacrifice. He knew that we Japanese did horrible things to each other. The societal challenge upon their return was almost as brutal as the fighting itself. The Japanese government had announced that the Iwo Jima defenders had perished in a gyokosai. This was deemed a glorious general attack. Official death notices had been sent home to families. Families were left with the illusion of martyrdom. The painful irony for the survivors was that they were returning as ghosts. Omagari's mother mistook him for a specter. Akikusa attended his own funeral service, standing beside his own portrait. The nation expected them to be enshrined at Yasukuni Shrine. Instead, they were living embarrassments. The reality for countless bereaved families was the solemn, heartbreaking delivery of an empty cardboard box. This was a stark symbol of a body that could not be recovered. It was a hollow contrast to the wooden urns that once held the remains of heroes. This pervasive shame was so profound that one prisoner of war jumped to his death from the repatriation ship. Kiichi Abe noted that the man was unable to face the disgrace of being taken alive. For those who endured, the focus shifted to rebuilding shattered lives in a devastated land. Akikusa married Ayako on Christmas Day, 1946. He began working for Tobu Tetsudo Railways, trying to impose order on a life consumed by chaos. The public, however, quickly sought to forget the crushing defeat. They preferred narratives of heroic endurance. It took decades and the unexpected catalyst of modern media to reignite public interest. Films released around 2009 helped give veterans a voice. Akikusa felt this was a turning point. It allowed the sacrifices of his generation to be acknowledged before they passed into oblivion. Yet reconciliation was a complex, generational endeavor. Terako Abe was a refugee and widow whose husband was killed on Iwo Jima. She channeled her immense loss into activism. She created peace bell amulets as a symbol of shared human tragedy. She said, "It was the war that destroyed my family." She was acknowledging that both sides suffered unspeakable losses. The physical island itself remained an enduring, poignant link to the past. Years after the conflict, the author sought a tangible connection to the logistical failures that doomed the garrison. He visited the wreckage of the Hinkomaru. This was a converted merchant vessel sunk near the island. Snorkeling above the silent, corroded hulk, he witnessed the remains of the ship. This ship had struggled to breach the American blockade. It was a vast, skeletal monument to the desperate missions and lost supplies. The most profound acts of reconciliation often occurred through the small, personal gestures. The enduring connection between American veterans and the island led to the creation of the U.S.-Japan reunion of honor ceremonies. It was through these efforts that a piece of the past was finally returned. Private Shinji Ehara's pith helmet, lost in the fighting, was found and returned to his brother. This simple act symbolized the possibility of peace. It was the passage of a battered piece of military issue from one generation to another, across two nations. It demonstrated the shared recognition of the human cost. Iwo Jima's legacy is ultimately one of immense tragedy. As Omagari firmly maintained, he found no honor in his wartime experience. He actively opposed the exhumation of remains. He argued, "We defenders said if we died, we would become the soil of Iwo Jima." The ultimate lesson is underscored by the struggle of the survivors. Like Akikusa, he reflected that peace is beautiful and must always be protected. He concluded that the question of whether his countrymen suffered and died needlessly remained a sad and difficult one. Ultimately, he realized the war taught him the value of life, of everyone's life. The sharing of these individual stories was essential. This included the personal grief of the widows and the shame of the returning soldier. The quiet acts of cross-cultural remembrance were the final, necessary steps. These steps moved us toward a truly balanced historical understanding of the Pacific War. If you value these historical accounts, please subscribe to the channel and like this video. It helps us preserve these stories. And please, share your own memories or thoughts in the comments below.